In our last conversation, you were basically setting up that the end of the Iran war would come right in line with the IPOs.
I think it's already been signed, and now they're just playing theatrics. They're trying to time it with the liquidity needs of the major IPOs that are coming.
Where do you think we're heading next? What's your read on the situation?
Who won? The financial industrial complex and transnational capital won. The reality is China won. That means that they can control both the petrodollar and petro-yuan. If you think Trump works for the American people, then nothing makes sense. Trump's a transaction guy. His job as a deal maker is to put deals together for his lobbies. The markets were never saying that this was a real war. If there was a real war, I was saying gold would be moving in parallel to oil. They have completely cornered the short-term price of Bitcoin to manipulate it, but their goal is to get your Bitcoin in custody. The technical industrial complex are ushering in an Orwellian AI surveillance state, one world control grid, social credit scores, central bank digital currencies, stable coins. You will own nothing and be happy. We'll custody the assets, you get the token, and you become a perpetual gambler.
All right, good morning, Simon. Thank you so much for joining me, for jumping back on. I needed to have you back because in our last conversation with Professor Dave Cullum, you were basically setting up that the end of the Iran war would come right in line with the IPO, so the SpaceX IPO. And lo and behold, you were bang on. You were dead right. We got the first whispers of it the Thursday before, I believe, coming from the Pakistan Prime Minister. We had the SpaceX IPO on Friday, and then on Sunday, the whole 250th anniversary celebration there in the UFC event, they were saying it was done. It was complete. And it seems to be that actually was the case. So I wanted to get your immediate kind of response, your feedback. Looks like the deal is done. I'm curious, where do you think we're heading next? What's your read on the situation?
Yeah, sure. So if we rewind back when I first came on your podcast to discuss Iran, I think it was like 100 days ago or something to that, when it first broke out. Prior to that, we were discussing Venezuela and various other things. When the Iran war broke out, the headline on your video was me saying, this is a war, a managed transition between the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex. And the military industrial complex represents the more nationalistic US dominated post-World War II Bretton Woods order. And the financial industrial complex are transitioning the world into multipolarity, while the technical industrial complex are ushering in an Orwellian AI surveillance state, one world control grid that consists of artificial intelligence, social credit scores, central bank digital currencies, stable coins, tokenize everything. You will own nothing and be happy. We'll custody the assets, you get the token, and you become a perpetual gambler. That's those were like the dynamics at work. And so if you look through what we saw, Netanyahu, I've always said, is middle management for the military industrial complex. That consists of, the radical Zionists in Israel, the neocon evangelical Christian boomers in America, and then factions of power within the IRGC that benefit from the continuation of a forever war. Those are, kind of the net beneficiaries of servicing the military industrial complex. If you want to transition to a world of multipolarity, the Middle East becomes effectively a go-between, a financial go-between between China-led BRICS SEO blocks and America as a regional power that dominates Europe and the Western Hemisphere, but private corporate interests dominated by those three factions of private corporate power, MIC, FIC, and TIC. And so FIC aligned with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, which are predominantly funded by energy purchases from China. So transnational capital, you have, the financial industrial complex, which is hosted in New York, the stock market, the bond market, London factions like the insurance market, the FX markets, the derivative markets, the Swiss Bank for International Settlements, But all the liquidity is on New York, in the New York Stock Exchange, and NASDAQ. And so that faction co-opted the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, i.e. you get to joint invest in every deal. But because they are trade surplus countries and America is world reserve currency, the dollar becomes a vehicle for asset stripping the West. And then you have to partner with those that maintain their energy, and are able to have large sovereign wealth funds who end up purchasing all the assets. And as they purchase more and more assets, they exert more control. Foreign direct investment is the vehicle for exerting control in the financial industrial complex, assets under administration. But it is all backed up by the largest manufacturing base in the world, which is China. And so that creates an informal allegiance of capital, which can dictate the flow of funds globally. And the other part of that is energy. And so the energy part, you got Netanyahu, that is the most paid figurehead for the military industrial complex. For the financial industrial complex, you got Trump. Trump's a transaction guy, and his job as a deal maker is to put deals together for his lobbies. And his lobbies he's mainly aligned with FIC. He's not a neocon. He's a bankster that kind of looks, he's a deal maker that works for capital.
Yeah.
Is the way to think about him. Then you have, so by closing the Strait of Hormuz, you manufacture a crisis, just like COVID shutdowns, which was also under the Trump administration, Operation Warp Speed 2.0. But you manufacture a pricing event that concentrates wealth upwards, which is more like the global World Economic Forum agenda. And when you think about all those different companies, let's say the CEO, the representative of the World Economic Forum is Larry Fink and BlackRock, because they got the most assets under administration. And Larry Fink and BlackRock, is kind of part of this financial industrial complex. And so by pricing everyone out, you get massive concentration of power upwards. You get, through fiscal dominance, a stock market boom. And the tension happens in the currency market and the bond market. And so throughout this whole war, I was saying, once the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, I was looking at the yields on the 30-year, the yields on the 10-year, the price of oil as a mechanism for pricing everyone out and creating inflation. And the markets were never saying that this was a real war. If there was a real war, I was saying gold would be moving in parallel to oil, as well as looking at those bonds. And then eventually that would justify an environment for QE in order to prop up stocks. And so the market knew that this was a temporary state of being. And so I was always expecting a deal to be done. Now, I didn't get the timing right. I was saying that this is going to be similar to the 12-day war. But once I saw that the Hormuz was, the Strait was going to be closed, I could see that there was the opportunity to renegotiate every single contract, including the flow of energy, and that this was going to manage a transition of about 2 to 5 years of events into probably a concentrated, what looks like, a 90-day period followed by a 60-day and everything that goes in between. But the markets were telling me that this was theatrical, but also a power struggle. And so I go back to who won. The financial industrial complex and transnational capital won. And so we're now getting into the phase of managing narratives so that we can transition to this multipolar world order. And so the first stage was to announce the deals being done. And the last time we talked, I said, liquidity is incredibly important right now. And so in the leading up to the Xi Jinping and Trump meeting, I thought something will change there. I thought maybe that would be the timing to get a deal done. But what it actually was, it was a signal. It was a signal for Xi Jinping to exert his, let's say, optical vision of how the world has changed. that it is all the Mick and Fick and Tick executives begging Xi Jinping to not shut down their factories of cheap labor, to not shut down their rare earth minerals for all of this AI bubble that's needed, and to make sure that semiconductor chips are still flowing. And that was the purpose of the Xi Jinping meeting. And Xi Jinping publicly said, leave Taiwan and we're all good. And that was really it. And so Trump came and said, Taiwan off limits to the MIC. And the MIC, now we entered into a transitionary phase. And that transitionary phase was publicly stating, here's what a deal looks like. And that is a FIC deal. If you look at every single part of the 14 points, these are financial transactions. And the construct of those financial transactions is what the purpose of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the theatrical war in order to lead to this resetting of the world order. So now we've got the 14 points. And I said, what would I do if I were FIC? Well, I'd probably want to make sure that the SpaceX IPO went very well. And so one way of ensuring that it goes very well is to announce on the Thursday prior to the Friday, have the weekend, and then come back on a Monday. And it required vast amounts of liquidity, because if the SpaceX IPO doesn't go well, then that will affect the stock market, Anthropic, OpenAI, and it will weaken the negotiations for the FIC. And so this was the point at which the FIC, which ultimately controls the MIC, exerts their right. This is a managed transition. There's bounded escalation. Oil's allowed to go up to these prices, but every time it goes to demand destruction phase, then Trump, you need to do some kind of taco story. And so Trump would come out with a taco. There'd be a bunch of market manipulation, but it would get the price of oil down, from that bounded level. And every time the yields were blowing out above 5% on the 30-year, 4.5% on the 10-year, you get another taco. And so bondholders, which are FIC, and their portfolio of LNG and oil companies that were benefiting from these higher prices. And the reason this was so chaotic is because Trump's middle management, he probably doesn't know what's coming next. His job is to just create a narrative, and FIC is trying to get the best terms. And Trump is the front man, just like in China, right? I'm the front man for all these real power, all these executives. Those executives work for the board. The board are representative of the shareholders, and the shareholders is dominated by FIC. And so that's the hierarchy. Trump's the gateway to FIC. Netanyahu's the gateway to MIC. In MIC, you have the deep state, Mossad, MI6, and CIA. And so you bound these escalation cycles, but ultimately, when a deal needs to be done and when FIC's ready to do it, you can say, hey, Mick, why don't you go blow up Lebanon? Why don't you escalate there? And then that will give us more leverage. And then Trump and Netanyahu play good cop and bad cop. And so Trump says, we're doing a deal, we're doing a deal. Netanyahu says, no, you're not, I rule the world. That creates a public narrative for Americans, given that they've decided, or they've been exposed to the new narrative that they didn't have before, that Israel rules the world and this the Epstein class and Netanyahu is the power of all powers. That is the narrative, because eventually Trump will exert influence over Netanyahu. Netanyahu will be regime changed. And then we'd lead to a Israel that integrates into GCC and FIC and manages its transition away from being the forever war model. And so that's what I'm thinking is coming next. On the Iran side, you needed to put it into a position where it has to get reconstruction contracts and it doesn't have financial capacity in order to rebuild that without negotiating. And I said, Iran will go deeper into China. Israel will go deeper into GCC, and then China normalizes between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and you have a bunch of good cop, bad cop. Iran's job is to destroy the US military bases, manufacture the crisis event, close the Strait of Hormuz. UAE is to kind of play good cop, bad cop with Saudi, where Saudi looks like the one we're not going to normalize until there's Palestinian state. UAE looks like we're going deep into Israel. They come out of OPEC. That breaks the petrodollar, which is required. You also have the tariff war that pushes Japan away. So you need rates to go up to break the Japan carry trade. And then you change the euro dollar. The euro dollar is FX swap lines. And so lo and behold, UAE gets an FX swap line while coming out of OPEC, which is both halves of the petrodollar breaking. So you break the petrodollar, you break the euro dollar, and you break the Japan carry trade. And then you vassalize Europe up into the Western Hemisphere, into American private control. The region of the Middle East becomes effectively West Asia, which is, integrated into a BRICS, GCC, SCO regional. You get a new regional security model, which is Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia being a financier. A new financial corridor, which is UAE, which ended up getting the network of central bank digital currencies, Enbridge, the FX swap line with the Federal Reserve, so it can now create dollars, and the breaking of OPEC, which was what propped up the petrodollar. All of that happens in UAE, and Iran, now the second largest LNG provider in the world, is going to have a bunch of LNG contracts to be renegotiated, a bunch of rebuild contracts, which are going to require significant investment. And what are they going to price those 2 to 4 million barrels of additional oil that will come on? And so there was always a belief that some people would believe that Trump was playing 5D chess. The one that was playing 5D chess is the one that doesn't have a press department, China. And China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Iran and the GCC had a very clever strategy for redefining the industry. And the story will be told when you look at who gets the investment contracts. I guarantee you, or my hypothesis is, that there'll be a bunch of China Belt and Road Initiative, GCC Gulf Country Sovereign Wealth Funds, and financial industrial complex nodes that Trump was representing to get as much of a foothold, so that regional stability is now the dominant game that everyone's incentivized to play, from Iran to Saudi to UAE to Turkey to Egypt to China to BRICS to SCO, to the private corporate interest that owns the West. And that's the transition I think we're seeing. So what is being dominated right now? We needed to have, and I remember saying this early on, a three-way narrative that allows for Israel, America, and Iran to be able to push back to their relative constituents that kind of gets the most radicalized version of their fan and political base to believe they won. The reality is China won, and Iran is somewhat of a proxy of China. I don't think proxy is the right word, because they maintain their own, autonomy. And I'm just trying to simplify, because there's different factions of power within each country, which are more aligned and less aligned. But there's no doubt that there was no regime change. IRGC, if you remember what I said those that were negotiating before the war are all still alive, and they were negotiating during the war and after the war. That's Arachi, that's Gallivant, that's all the people that are still putting forward this deal right now.
Did they get the hardliners out? I know we talked about getting rid of the hardliners in the IRGC in Iran. Did they actually remove the hardliners, or does it appear that they did?
Yeah, so that was Israel's role. Israel's role was, again, this goes into the bit more conspiratorial part of it. But I believe that there was a faction of power within Iran that they can never admit, so we'll never be able to prove this, because it would cause regional instability and all sorts of stuff. But there was a faction of power within Iran that was aligned with China, and Iran was reporting to China in order to transition to this regional stability model. Here's the people within the IRGC that would never be on board. And those were the ones that were decapitated. And that was Iran that they outsourced, Israel, that they outsourced that to. So Israel did the decapitation campaigns. American military industrial complex profited from breaking up, killing infrastructure. Iran got all the US infrastructure out of the region. China would then go to Pakistan and say, you put together the regional model and you get the Islamabad Accords. Anything that's negotiated will have your name on it. Why Pakistan? Because Pakistan was the recipient of the Belt and Road Initiative. It was expelling the IMF. It used to be an IMF dollar vassal. It ran out of dollar reserves during COVID. Then it had to take bailout from the Gulf countries, which was UAE. Saudi then refinanced UAE, and China implemented Belt and Road Initiative. And it's important for the corridor of the post-world order as well, in terms of ports and various things, and the security agreement after US is expelled from the region slowly in terms of the MIC. And that's in effect how it played out. What we're at the phase of right now is a deal has been reached with, Iran stopped funding Hamas about a decade ago. It was predominantly funded by Qatar. Iran funded the military arm, but Qatar funded the political arm. And then the military arm got more aligned. And then there was a whole thing of Israel wanting continual state of conflict in order to justify the false flag of October the 7th. And so the Israeli banking system via UAE was allowing Qatari money via Qatar to fund the military arm of Hamas. Now, people interpret that as, so Hamas are traitors or something. It's way more nuanced than that. All you need to do is infiltrate at the higher levels, Iran to stop backing at higher levels. And most people don't know who they're working for. So it's way more nuanced than that. And that's how all these things work. It's on a need-to-know basis. There's genuine resistance. There's genuine grievance here. But we all know that October the 7th was nothing like it was reported in the media. That's because, Netanyahu, the MIC, the deep state, they can feed stories into the Western media. Like all of the fake stuff came from Netanyahu, was perpetuated by Biden. And none of the things that were allegedly happened on October the 7th were as they were reported. And the Hannibal Directive was initiated, where Israel put out Apache helicopters that killed loads of Israelis. We had the fake news that was reported on I won't say things that will get this YouTube, that YouTube won't like. But anyway, it was a BS operation to make it look. That was meant to happen because the destruction of Gaza was part of the plan. And if you remember correctly, it was leaked. The plan was leaked that the IMF was going to forgive Egypt of $18 billion if they ethnically cleansed the Palestinians and put them in the Sinai desert. But Egypt didn't do that because they had an alliance with GCC. And Saudi was saying, I will not normalize with Israel until there's a Palestinian state. And they've been saying that for 25 years. You won't hear that in Western media because they want you to think that Saudi's just a vassal of Israel and Zionism. But no, the order's changed because MIC isn't dominating the region anymore because of the rise of China, change of energy, and all the different things from changing the market. So all of this to say, when you follow the money, it's completely different to the narrative. And if you believe politicians are in charge, then you'll forever be in a state of confusion here. When you understand the West is controlled by private corporate interests, Mick, Fick, and Tick, then actually Trump did a great job for Mick, Fick, and Tick. The military got to profit from the war. The stock market got a stimulus of the 1.5 trillion Pentagon budget. The financial industrial complex is leaning into the investment contracts that will come, the rebuild contracts. They want a multipolar world so that they can invest into a multipolar world. They're partnered with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds in China. And the technical industrial complex want an AI-dominated world. We are definitely getting an AI-dominated world.
Yeah.
The contract, the entire world is flipped upside down now for this AI-dominated world. Now, what's interesting is that requires vast amounts of energy. So what is the public-facing narrative of this war? Nuclear weapons, terrorist financing. That's just public consumption BS. This was always about nuclear energy, the pricing of that energy, and the transition to a multipolar world. And in order to achieve that, you needed to close the Strait of Hormuz. In order to close the Strait of Hormuz, you need to say Iran needed to say we will target any ships. Lloyd's of London need to say we won't insure you. And then US needed to say we'll allow the shipment to get through on our part of the blockade. And the only ships that got through required Lloyd's of London, US, and IRGC to let them get through. The only people that had that leverage is China. And China had relationships via BRICS to India. And then there's GCC, Qatar, and various other things. And you also remember that I said there was a wave of hedged investment prior to the war. One is that China built up the largest oil reserves in the world that exist, so they could control the price of oil and survive it all out. So it was never about. They were also very aware of both the Syria operation, where there was a change in leadership, a regime change there. Also the Venezuelan operation. Those were allowed to happen by China, by Iran, and by Russia. And that's why those were smooth operations. There's no way those would be that smooth unless world leaders had agreed that this is the way that we would like that to go. And so, that was leading up to that. Qatar had invested in the Golden Pass, a partnership with ExxonMobil that benefits from all the LNG in Texas. Saudi Aramco had made an investment into a subsidiary, Mivera, which was 100% owned by Saudi Aramco, that is benefiting from refining oil from Venezuela in Texas. And we had the alternative pipelines that had been built that would reduce the amount of oil, but allowed UAE and Saudi Arabia to effectively, get alternative pipelines out there. The only way to stop them would be if the Houthis shut down the Red Sea. And the Houthis never shut down the Red Sea. Why? Because the Houthis had already signed an agreement over Yemen. And Yemen, remember there was that little war, fake war, I called it, between UAE and Saudi and Yemen. That resolved Somalia, Yemen, the ports, and all of the different ports prior to any of this happening. And so if you were following this all the way through, right from Trump administration 1, you could see that Iran was managing a process of regional integration backed by China. And this was the final part of the process. The negotiations had started a long time ago, and I believe that the negotiations were the theatrical war that we just watched. Now, that doesn't mean that the deaths didn't happen, because the Mick is always willing to kill people. I mean, that's just part of the game. Israel and the radical Zionist factions of Mick, if they want to do some false flags, if they want to get some leverage, if they want to try and change a game, they can. Some of the people in power within IRGC partnered with Russia. They can try and flip the board. So throughout this, you had your factions of resistance against the FIC plan. But I always believed the FIC would ultimately win. And the FIC has, I believe right now, ultimately won. And that's the phase we're at right now. That's what's being negotiated.
Look, there's a reason Simon Dixon keeps showing up on podcasts and just relentlessly hammering Bitcoin in self-custody. It actually matters. If you want to get it done right, whether you're just getting started or you need to level up your security, me and the team over at btcmentor.io will make sure you're taken care of. Scan the QR code or click the link in the description down below. All right, let's get back into it. That's fantastic. Let me just pull apart a few things there. One, something that Doomberg actually said to me the other day really stood out, because you talked about how the GCC wanted the corridor, wanted the area open for business. The financial industrial complex wanted that area stabilized and open for business. And he was pointing out that if Iran is going to have an environmental fee or any sort of toll on the Strait of Hormuz, that means that they can't be sanctioned. You can't be exchanging with a sanctioned country, so that means that sanction is gone. It's off the table. I thought that was very interesting in terms of everything kind of opening back up. One thing that I did want to pull apart and see if you have any information on is, I believe I saw JD Vance talking about $300 billion in terms of possible investment for the reconstruction in Iran. I can see why the different factions would want to bid on the contracts and get that, but where would the money originally be coming from? Who would be funding the reconstruction in Iran, and necessarily why?
That is the big question. And that will determine who had the most leverage in this managed transition. So if Iran had all the leverage, then it would just fund it itself. To fund it itself, then it would need the other parts of the deal to come through, which is all of the sanction money to be returned.
Oh, yeah.
All of the shipment, fees on shipments. And the removal of sanctions. So those are the negotiation. All of these are financial negotiation. And this is why, effectively, this will offend a lot of people that are very pro-Iran, pro-resistance. And again, I always say this. I have my humanitarian hat, which I'm not talking with right now. And I have my analytical hat. My humanitarian hat cannot stand everything that my analytical hat is saying. But my analytical hat says, I don't care about what you want to happen. This is what is happening. And this is what's happening based upon the power dynamics. And the power dynamics is that I've always said there will be a Palestinian state, and it will be rebuilt by Gulf investment contracts. And China's probably the only one that has the capacity to actually build it with the Palestinians. And Iran, this was the friction, right? And this was, what is the mix that happens in the end? Are they autonomous? I personally believe that no, it won't be autonomous. But if the IRGC played their cards right, they could have got that to full autonomy. However, the problem is there was always a timeline in terms of the economic impact on the bond market. And so the bondholders were always saying, we can't have these bonds blow out unless we regime change the Fed. So you need Kevin Walsh, in there. You need QE in order to allow bonds to go out so that you can do yield curve control. And that was always the natural timeline that was here. Now, if China, in their negotiations with in the Beijing meeting, would have said Taiwan off limit, and we want to invest in Iran. We want the Middle East to be regionally stable. And we don't want the financial industrial complex getting its evil mitts where they have enough control over the region to destabilize it and hand it back over to Mick and go back to the forever war. And so China would have, in all of their agreements, said, we're going to be investing via this SPV or Cayman Island entity or Hong Kong company, whatever it may be. And the FIC would have said, all right, we'll go get Netanyahu to blow up Lebanon, kill more civilians, get a reaction, and that will give us more negotiation leverage. And so they would have been weaponizing death, destruction, massacre in order to get more leverage. China wants regional stability. And in Iran, with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, had a time frame, and the bond market was determining. So Trump was always trying to figure out, what do I need to say in order to get those yields back down and the price of oil back down?
38 times. It was 38 times that he pivoted.
Yeah, that was a combination of taco and insider trading. And I'm sure he was making shit tons of money. And remember, Trump had been bought by the Gulf countries via Affinity Partners, his venture capital fund, which was funded up to $5 billion 2 billion of which came from Saudi. And so while everyone was focusing on APAC and Israel rules the world, there was a tiny little budget from APAC, a narrative that was we rule the world, while meanwhile there was billions in regional stability coming from the Gulf countries. And they'd already normalized with Iran, so they were all effectively on the same team, but they also have their own power struggle. So Iran wants to make sure that 300 billion is funded by itself. But the fact that they announced it, if it disappears, then Iran is going to be autonomous and will fund it itself. If it comes back as reparations, that's a lie. It's not reparations. It's going to be structured as a fund with investment contracts. And those investment contracts will reflect how much power the financial industrial complex managed to negotiate via using MIC to create as much death and destruction and seize as much land and the Greater Israel Project and all of that BS. And so MIC, they go and, Israel does all the death destruction. You got your plausible deniability story when you want to manage the creative divorce. It was them, it wasn't us, we were blackmailed, it was Epstein.
Yep.
And all of those are true, but it's not Israel, it's the MIC. Israel is a vassal of the MIC. If the 300 billion is predominantly China, then China had the real upper hand and gave concessions to FIC in their negotiations, which is the one world government technocratic AI partnership between China and the TIC, which is happening. That's the AI arms race we're led to believe, which has led to the stock market bubble. Because China can burst the bubble whenever they want, I said during our Dave Cullen interview.
Yep.
If the Gulf actually ends up with the most of the investment, and then you get a security pact between Iran, Saudi, Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan, then they had either Chinese shell companies in that construct, and so China obfuscated it via the region, but the region will have a degree of autonomy that means that they can control both the petrodollar and petro-yuan and the LNG dollar and the LNG yuan moving into this new model. And so I don't listen to anything the politicians say, any of the rhetoric. That's all BS for political reasons. I'll be analyzing what those contracts look like in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran, in the Gulf countries, and the hidden financial flows behind them. That will tell you what the next century looks like. That's the new world order right there. And so that's what we, that's what I'll be analyzing. And that money will tell you the real power dynamics and who's in charge here or who's got more leverage than someone else. And if there's less and less FIC, it means that you have to have some FIC, because if you have no FIC, then you may get a situation where it returns to the forever war and Mick comes in and tries to do covert operations.
I was going to ask, was there any way that they could, let's assume that it was FIC at play, that they were in control, and that this is moving forward with the new multipolar setup. Is it possible for Mick, or would Mick at some point in time try and reassert itself? I'm thinking about even Netanyahu seemed to be barking a little bit at the end of the war there, that he was, I think, making threats that he wasn't going to adhere to the deal between the U.S. and Iran, that he doesn't take orders from the U.S. I believe is exactly what I saw. Is it possible that the Mick tries to reassert itself and kick things off again?
Yes, very possible. So this won't be smooth.
Okay.
But when FIC wants to exert dominance, it can. And so it can use MIC to make profit, sell more bombs, create more destruction, get more leverage, but it's always going to be bounded. And if Netanyahu goes off on his own path, then he'll be regime changed. And I think he's already negotiated his regime change. And that will lead into the political cycle, which starts in October, November in the case of Israel. Then you have midterms in the case of Trump. That's what keeps them on track. So they will try and leverage their own position, but they're ultimately subordinate in this power structure. And if they showed any type of autonomy, then they'd just be JFK'd at the extreme.
Okay. Yep. Nope. That makes sense. The other thing I wanted to quickly hit on, because we talked about it a few times as well, is that we had this giant acid strip of the middle class that was going on. It seems like they did a pretty good job. From your read on the situation, is the acid strip side of the operation moving basically money up the hierarchy to power? Has that completed? Is that done, or is there still? I'm wondering if there might be another major event on the horizon, some sort of theatrics that requires, like, are we talking about like the AI bailouts, or if there's more to be on the watch for that'll be trying to pull money away from those who don't really have the most of it?
Yeah, so I think we're done predominantly. There could be some drama, with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but look, I believe the MOU will be signed on Friday. If you look at this
Okay.
week, we got what did we have on Monday? So Monday we had the G7 meeting.
Yep.
What's come out of the G7 meeting? Trump exerting influence narrative over Netanyahu, saying you didn't need to kill that many people in Lebanon. The Hezbollah, yeah, they're that, but come on, there's better ways of dealing with Hezbollah. So Trump is now preparing for, he's been given permission. Netanyahu knows his future. We don't know it yet, but he's now allowed to say, by the way, I'm in charge at this stage. So he gets more and more of that narrative so that the MAGA-tards can think, oh yeah, he was playing 5D chess. And that leads into and I believe this would have all been negotiated. Whenever you do an M&A deal, the communication strategy is always negotiated. You draft what people can say when they can say it. And most people think it's organic, but it's not.
Yeah.
So we had the G7 meeting, and that was all about Ukraine, Russia, energy crisis, Europe screwed, basically nothing new there. Russia, Ukraine will continue. There's another $1 trillion for Mick to make in compensation. They're about to lose a load of money from the Middle Eastern forever war. They need to make all that money back from NATO and Europe, and they need the Russia-Ukraine thing to continue. And the other thing is, Trump showing I'm in charge by narrative. So all the clips are circulating, and everyone makes their own opinion about what that is. Then today, what did we got Fed tomorrow,
Kevin
right?
Warsh. Yeah, Kevin Warsh, I think, is
tomorrow.
today and tomorrow. Yep.
Yeah, so I think rates will remain unchanged. Oh, today we had Bank of Japan, so they raised their rates.
Yes, 1%, first time since 1995.
Absolutely. So that's breaking of the Japan carry trade. So the liquidity from Japan is going to dry up now. That free trade to invest in US stocks goes. The Bank of Japan and the Fed can rug pull the US whenever they want. And so they've got that trade going. So Japan's leaning more into Asia, decoupling bit by bit without a managed transition. Kevin Warsh, I think, is too soon. Probably nothing will happen tomorrow. Rates remain unchanged. If we get an increase in rate or a decrease in rate, that will definitely take the market by shock.
That's a major signal. Yeah, I think we'll just get. I think we'll be analyzing the transcripts for slight differences in the words used at the press releases, like just with a fine-tooth comb.
Yeah. So my forecast is unchanged, but if he does raise it, that could have serious impact on the AI trade and markets and everything. If he does raise it, and if he decreases it, I mean, basically that can pump or dump SpaceX from here.
Yeah.
And so SpaceX had a very smooth IPO. They're now trying to acquire companies using their money printer of the SpaceX ATM. They can now buy any company with the money that they printed from the huge valuation it's holding. So that's a nice narrative. So really, the Federal Reserve sets the terms. So we had G7 Monday. We had Bank of Japan today. We got Federal Reserve tomorrow, which is the banks, the FIC are the shareholders in the Fed. Kevin Warsh is just spokesperson, chairman for the banks, and the FOMC in the board. Friday, what have we got on Thursday is Bank of England.
Of course it is.
Yeah. So whether Bank of England hikes or remains, I think they'll probably remain. We've already had some hikes. And then Friday we have the alleged signing of the deal.
Yep.
And so if this deal is signed, which apparently it is signed, I think the all the agreements have been done other than any kind of derailing, but they've all left themselves a card, and that is Lebanon. Yep. And so, you know, anytime you want to derail it, IRGC can create action in the Strait of Hormuz, and Israel can create action in Lebanon.
Yep.
And those are really, if you want to derail, those are the two things to derail. But overall, we'll get to the deal. It would just change the terms slightly.
Well, I think it'd be very interesting if Israel did take action in Lebanon and then Iran chose not to derail the deal. I feel like that would be very informative.
Yeah, so they're going to keep us like analyzing that. Look, my overarching theory is that eventually all of the resistance will slowly be integrated into the local political systems. So Houthis within Yemen, Hamas within Gaza, which will have a GCC-funded rebuild plan. And Israel will be privatized more and more and more. UAE's been buying more and more deals in Israel. If you get I'm not sure if the Abraham Accords is dead or Trump tries to pull that one off again. But either way, it's just about buying Israeli assets. And so whoever joins Abraham Accords gets to buy Israeli assets. There's been a long-term privatization of Israel. More and more IPOs are happening later this year. That's FIC controlling Israel, basically.
Yeah.
And if UAE and all the other GCC countries get to co-invest, then they get to buy it. And I think that will be part of it. And if they buy it, they will regime change to a GCC-friendly leadership rather than a MIC-friendly leadership right now. That's transitioned to a FIC friendly leadership. And then slowly over the next 5 years, I think you'll see a Palestinian majority. Something still needs to happen over West Bank because that's still illegally occupied. That might be a transition from a two-state solution to a one-state solution. But you still got that one to figure out. And within Lebanon, I expect this to kick off a process of Hezbollah being integrated into the Lebanese army and the Lebanese political system. And then in North Africa, those are GCC dominated. They would have Turkey, Egypt, Saudi, and UAE would have split those up and decided what they're doing there. But slowly, I'd expect in North Africa those conflicts to be resolved, and the American proxies and the European proxies like ISIS, Al Qaeda, M23, M13, SDF, and all these different proxies to slowly reintegrate into the region, and then all the civil unrest comes to the Western Hemisphere. is the prediction there.
Okay, well, that's not necessarily the ending that I just gotta get out of Dodge. Apparently, everyone keeps telling me to leave Canada, and I feel like I absolutely must at one point in time. And I did want to hit on something specific regards to mentioning the G7 and the technical industrial complex as well. We talked a little bit about AI, but one thing that was on my radar recently, which seems to be moving both very quickly in both the UK and in Canada, is this push for digital ID verification. You can't have to be over 16 to be on social media. I was curious, in your view, if that is the tick imposing itself on these governments as well, or if it's perhaps unrelated.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So all the technology was tested in the Palestinian laboratory. What they rebuild in Palestine is what they would like to do around the world. That's the beta for all the technology that makes its way to our smartphones that was originally innovated for killing people. And that's why Israel was there, to have plausible deniability so that the MIC can test this technology, the TIC can test this technology in Africa and in the Middle East and in the war zones. Once it's sufficiently beta tested, It then gets acquired into companies like Apple, Microsoft, the Magnificent Seven, and then it gets deployed through false flag operations and false narratives across the West. We've always had Australia, UK, and Canada as the beta tests.
Yep.
It's always covertly done in America, through NSA operations. But then it becomes overt. And in order to go overt, you need false flags. So you need narratives like domestic terrorism, which is why you really manufacture immigration crisis, which is why you radicalize people into these different algorithms. But yeah, what we've got is the next phase. So what Keir Starmer, who predominantly is I'd say more Mick and Fick funded. So, he's the one that pushes the whole with, apparently the Brits are still trying to save democracy by sending weapons to Ukraine so that they can cipher off money launder and prop up the stock markets. Apparently we're still trying to defend democracy there. So European Union, NATO, and UK are pushing out that BS. They'll do that till the last Ukrainian is dead. They don't care. Mick will just carry on. And the longer you believe that, the more you're supporting that. It's complete BS. And then on the tick side, there's been a lot of funding of groups via Israel, like Tommy Robinson, and these different divide and conquer white nationalist movements, anti-immigration movements, then the pro-Palestinian, then the Jews rule the world, just real divide and conquer, all sorts of...
Just turn up the heat on everybody.
All sorts of craziness. As you're taking people deeper and deeper into poverty, which those that don't own the assets are going to get worse, they're going to get less and less benefits because the end goal is a universal basic income. That's the end goal.
Yeah.
And the universal basic income is to supply enough money to those that are on the wrong side that don't own the assets, where they can still consume to prop up the valuations of the AI stocks that control everything, the social credit scores, the artificial intelligence, the stable coins, and the central bank digital currencies. And so you can see the slow transition. So in UK, you had the ratcheting up of those narratives that led to the pre-crime arrest technology, where they were scraping all the social media in order to arrest people before they actually took the actions. And a lot of that was happening in Canada, UK trucker style things, Australia, and UK. And these are the ones where you get the biggest, narratives around immigration. So you make people broke and then you give them an other. And then once they got an other, they can say, the source of my problems is you, Keir Starmer, and you, the immigrants, when they just don't know Mick, Fick, and Tick are paying and in charge, and they're just serving their lobbies. And then the next one they did was, freedom of speech, not freedom of reach. They allow us all to talk online, but we're building our social credit score. You had Genius Act, Clarity Act, that is stable coins. European Union doing central bank digital currencies along the China side. Then the next one you need everyone to be forced to give their data in order to use the internet. So you create a narrative around, we don't want our children consuming pornography.
It's always
every parent in the world will relate to that. Just like every person in 9/11 said, we've got to get those terrorists after they blew up the World Trade Center. And so you just keep going with these different things. And now all of a sudden, we're protecting the children. But now, in order for anyone in the UK to use the internet, they need to either have a digital ID, or they need to verify and download an app in the UK and give all their data. That will eventually be integrated with their stablecoin or central bank digital currency, depending on the path for that country, which will then only be spent for national security and because of domestic terrorists, which will be false flag operations that they'll create. And if you don't create them, if they don't radicalize you enough, so you create them, then they'll create them, the MI6, CIA, Mossad. If they get caught, it's the whole, oh, Israel controls us, blackmail operation, plausible deniability. Yeah, so the next thing is, and then you download the app, and then the app will say you cannot spend your money eventually unless you get this digital ID, and this makes up your digital ID. Eventually, then it will be saying in the energy crisis, we need you to compete with these AI data centers. So you get a tokenized carbon credit score, and you have to trade your ability to access this energy. And the World Economic Forum agenda, which is 100%, I know some of your other guests believe that Trump's fighting that. I mean, Trump has done more for the World Economic Forum agenda, but that's the uni party. I don't want to say, that I don't want to get in that left right BS, because it's just complete BS at this point. They all get paid by Mick, Fick, and Tick, and they all serve certain allegiances more. And Trump has been Tick and Fick, transnational capital and the technical industrial complex, which is World Economic Forum, across that side. So you will own nothing and be happy. They're trying to do it with Bitcoin. We got strategy, we got Bitcoin treasury companies, we got centralizing as much Bitcoin as possible.
There was one I saw dropped yesterday. BlackRock launched iShares Bitcoin Premium Income ETF, BITA, looking at 15 to 25% annualized returns, which, man, it really feels like they're turning up the dial on the carrot to try and get you to part with your Bitcoin. Like, that seems, no offense, straight out of like Celsius or BlockFi. Like, we're going to give you 25% annual return. Get the fuck out of here. This is like this. What are your thoughts on that? Sorry, I just wanted to get that in there.
So to close that one anyway, yes, the digital ID that's agenda that they'll keep mission creeping and raising the bar. Yeah, on the Bitcoin side, they definitely don't want you to own Bitcoin. That's been my long-term thesis. Strategy is a vehicle for centralizing as much Bitcoin as possible. We've now got MSTR, which still has a Bitcoin premium, but the Bitcoin per share is constantly being diluted. So then they launched the corporate, the preference share, convertible equity. That pulled in the FIC into the convertible debt. Once that, debt instrument, we then got the next phase, which is the digital credit.
Yeah.
And digital credit, which is a preference share that has a dividend that can be ended if you don't want to sell the Bitcoin. Do you want to sell the Bitcoin? As it goes away from its $100, you increase the yield, decrease the yield. I mean, he's created the most amazing arbitrage vehicle for FIC. And so what does FIC do? FIC it launches the ETF, and now BlackRock launches the ETF Bitcoin Income. And so now they can create the covered calls, the derivative complex, receive income. And whenever Jane Street wants to manufacture a short-term crash in the price of Bitcoin, then you wrap Jack Mallers and Bitcoin-backed loans and Bitcoin conferences through David Bailey and Bitcoin hedge funds, or Strike and Bitcoin-backed loans and the Cantor Fitzgerald via 21 Capital. You wrap as many of the ecosystem that you can reverse merger into a Bitcoin treasury company. So then you can push narrative. You can push leverage, and the more goes into the ETF, the more it's subordinate to FIC. And so they have completely cornered the short-term price of Bitcoin to manipulate it, but their goal is to get your Bitcoin in custody. You resist by holding it in self-custody and not leveraging it up. But that whole complex has been built, and it will get bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're getting all these weird narratives now around the different types of Bitcoiners, or the different types. We got digital collateral, digital credit, digital money, digital, all of these narrative creations in order to hide people from the obfuscation of self-custody Bitcoin into FIC. um, and yeah, that will keep going. The financial engineering will keep going. Nothing stops that train. So you just need to recognize the game and understand how to have a strategy around it. And the strategy is they've got the short-term price. If they want to margin call you, if they want to engineer a short-term crash, then you just do these little tricks. We saw it. Michael Saylor says, I'm selling 32 Bitcoin, sells it at $77,000. The price crashes, buys back 1,500 Bitcoin at $1,500 Bitcoin at $65,000. Great trade. That dilutes the Bitcoin per share. So then the price of STRC corrects back down. Then you can either increase the yield or you arbitrage it back up. And Jane Street and all the other hedgies in the background, and Cantor brings more and more, tries to fool more and more people into reverse mergering their companies into the fold. This is the game. That nothing stops this train. You just need to recognize it, and you turn all those people into subordinate FIC vehicles. Now suddenly Adam Back just promotes stable coins and all sorts of weird things like mining security tokens that have very questionable backgrounds. And this is how you get people. You subordinate them. You invite them to islands. You load them up with debt. You lever them up, and you incentivize them to put all of your assets into a FIC vehicle.
No, it's a very simple and very powerful and very helpful heuristic. Are they telling me to have Bitcoin in self-custody? No? Then be on alert. Then there's something else here at play. It really is just that. And the amount of people that I feel like, it's like they've talked themselves into overcomplicating something that's actually really quite simple, right? Just take the time to learn Bitcoin in self-custody. Don't lever it up. Don't try to play any fancy games with it. Everybody always gets in shit when they do. We've seen it happen again and again and again. And even right now, in what feels like the bottom of a bear market, the doldrums, the apathy has never been higher. It's like that's still just the right call, and you can see it. And you're starting to see more and more people talk about it, which I think is really important.
Yeah, here's the difference on this one, by the way. So before it was, if you look at the background of SBF, he's applying for his pardon right now with the Trump administration. We'll see where that goes. But on his board was Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell were the lawyers of CIA, Mossad, and MI6. So these are deep state operators. He was connected via MIT. He's in the Peter Thiel Fellowship. Peter Thiel is the currency speculator with George Soros, deeply connected into these deep state ops. He's all over the Epstein files, was trying to confuse people into store of value versus median of exchange. And in one of our episodes before the Iran war, we did the whole deep dive into Peter Thiel and Epstein.
Yep.
And when he tried to infiltrate Bitcoin. So SBF was connected that way. Alex Majinsky at Celsius, he was deeply connected via Daniel Leone. Daniel Leone has got an AI startup today. He's not in prison, while Majinsky is, with the Prime Minister's Office of Israel. He is in Israel right now. The company that was hacked for a chunk of the ETH was owned predominantly by the niece and nephew of Benjamin Netanyahu. The company that they acquired is an Israeli cybersecurity custody company. The wife of Daniel Leone was the IDF social media propagandist that was actually responsible for pushing out the story that UNRWA, the United Nations organization that was providing all the food to the Palestinians, was actually responsible for October the 7th, that led to the starvation and famine campaign in Palestine. She was the head of VP of loans at Celsius.
Really?
Yes. So this one was deep. We're also starting to see in this managed divorce with Israel, we're starting to see that much of the hacks that were traditionally blamed on Russia and North Korea seem to suddenly be Israel. Then I look back in history and wonder about things like the 119,000 hacked Bitcoin. And really, was that the person? Was it the crocodile of Wall Street that did that, Razakhan?
Yeah.
We know who her husband was connected to via their Ukraine networks. We know that a bunch of the money in FTX was connected to Ukrainian funding. And we know that where did all the laundering happen? It happened via the stablecoin networks that were built between Silvergate, Signature, Silicon Valley Bank, FTX, and Alameda, which was the technology that Silvergate purchased from the Libra project, which was Facebook.
Yep.
And so they had that network, which allowed for this facilitation of crime. And when we look back at it, who was it that rug pulled Silicon Valley Bank? It was when Peter Thiel came on Spaces and said, take your money out of Silicon Valley Bank. As a result of inflation is transitory after the Russia-Ukraine war. So call me a conspiracy theorist if you like, but it seems to always come back to the same players. And remember, that was the time that Peter Thiel was saying, I've sold all my Bitcoin and no one should be buying Bitcoin. Deeply integrated and connected into these infiltration networks. And so again, you can sit back and you can watch and what is that? That's the precursor. So when you took out Silicon Valley Bank, you then had the FTX bankruptcy, you then had the Celsius bankruptcy, you then had Voyager, you had Genesis, you had Gemini, you had all of those, the Barry Silbert network. Barry Silbert seemed to get away with everything. Alan Silbert, the brother of Barry Silbert that created INX, the security token exchange, a radical Zionist that I argued with many times. INX deeply connected to Israeli, ties in terms of, their founders and their team. So look back at these hacks. And I remember because I was deeply involved in the Bitfinex one and the Celsius one. We structured a recovery token for creditors. But I look back at all these events that seem unrelated, and suddenly, there definitely seem to be covert networks behind these hacks. And what was the result of the end of all of that deleveraging event? It was the banks that were approved. It was Trump coming in to create crypto capital and stablecoins and Genius Act. And it was BlackRock ETF. It was Michael Saylor's treasury companies. It was the copycat treasuries with the custodian of the bonds, which is Howard Lutnick and Cantor Fitzgerald. World Liberty Financial was what the money laundering organization for all these covert deals. And what did Trump do? He put his sons in charge, Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump. What did Steve Witkoff do? Hand it over to his son. What did Howard Lutnick do? Hand it over to the son. And so the next generation were doing these laundering operations. Apparently, if draining the swamp means handing over to the swamp, then Trump did an awesome job for Tick, Mick, and Fick. Everything makes sense if you can just recollaborate who Trump works for. If you think Trump works for the American people, then nothing makes sense. If you think he works for transnational capital with some compensation of wars for Mick, with an Orwellian technocratic governance structure for Tick, then Trump did everything he was paid to do. And the World Economic Forum will make sure that crypto is used so that they own the asset. You will own nothing. And how are they going to make you happy? Engineer a pump and dump in the AI bubble, which China can burst at any time, as we described in the last interview, through the stock market, commodity market, or bond market. And what will they replace you with? A universal basic income. So they built all the layers. Maybe JD Vance is that guy, the Palantir's guy, Peter Thiel's guy. Maybe there's a regime change into the Democrat. It doesn't matter. They'll corner both sides to get the same agenda. But you will own nothing and be happy means, let me translate this for you. They custody, you leverage, you get the token, you get the Wall Street wrapper, the stock, the vehicle. And when they rug pull it from you and you've got no Bitcoin in self-custody, they give you the universal basic income so that you are happy. And what would the universal basic income be? It will be just enough stable, programmatic, social credit score powered stablecoin that is spent into propping up the economy to concentrate more wealth into those that own the assets and those that own the AI at the end of this. And so I think where we came from this is there one more disaster?
Yeah.
I think the AI pump and dump is the next one. And that will be just like the dot-com boom and bust. The second wave of investors, so the VCs and the private equity and the FIC and the IPO and the investment banks and the commercial banks, they just made all their money through the IPO. That's done.
Yeah.
Then you
Do you think
got the
they'll wait for the unlock period, and do you think they'll wait for Anthropic and OpenAI to go public as well?
I do, yes.
Okay.
So Trump his job is to do fiscal dominance. Kevin's wash is to facilitate that. This will lead to that ginormous pump that gets all the capex and malinvestment to build all this new AI infrastructure. But what's interesting about the AI infrastructure is it expires in 3 years. You need to reinvest again in 3 years with all the latest chips. Where's all that money coming from? And so the private credit market is the too big to fail. That's how you get your QE. And the justification for it is national security, because we don't want China to win the AI race.
Yeah. Which, by the way, you're already seeing in terms of like, I always feel like Canada's like the test bed for stuff. So not only we're getting like digital ID and under 16, and they're going to have either digital ID or like age estimation, or you got to upload your information, which is already terrible too. But Canada's now going down this AI for all route, which is just absolutely ridiculous. We don't have the money to actually fund the infrastructure, and they're shooting themselves in the foot the entire way, including people keep trying to fight data centers. But I just thought it was really interesting on that point that we're already seeing U.S. neighbor saying, hey, as a matter of our own security and interest, because we don't want to be reliant on the U.S., we now have to do the Canadian government AI plan. I feel like they're always testing here first before trying down south.
Yeah, the governments are going to be replaced with AI, and the AI is going to be controlled by those that own the assets, the infrastructure, the chips, the data centers, the rare earth minerals, and that is a partnership between the FIC and China. The FICTIC in China. That is what was the the Beijing meeting. The Beijing meeting consisted of all those that control that AI control grid. And the second China wants to rug pull and reset the world order, they can just use the fact that they've got the gold and the West has the derivative contracts that are not backed by gold in the commodity market. They can sell their bonds to blow out the yields on the 30-year and 10-year, giving the justification for the Fed to print more money in order to get those yields back down, which means that the FIC gets the yield at the same time. China can just sell their bonds in order to do that, or Japan. Or they can do another DeepSeek moment and say, hey, by the way, all of that capex you just spent, you didn't need to spend it. Here's an infrastructure that doesn't require all of that. And by the way, you got to spend it again in 3 years. So they could rug pull the stock market. Not to say they will, but they can. And that's in partnership with FIC, and FIC will reposition. And so the moment, and remember, wasn't Trump meant to be taking on the Fed?
Yeah.
The Fed has the whole market cornered. If they increase rates or decrease rates, that tells the story of everything from here. The whole market has never been more sensitive to that.
Yep.
And if you want to bail it out, you bail it out with some stable coins, which helps the TIC agenda, the World Economic Forum agenda. And so now you have all the knobs and all the bits and bobs you need for the complete control by Fick and Tick. And Mick had to leave the Middle East, and they get Europe and Central and South America. And China gets to leverage that because Fick can't infiltrate China.
Yep.
And China knows that. This is why we have these capital controls and, making sure that no company is ever bigger than the Chinese government. Is a defense mechanism. I'm not saying you'd want to live there, but that's the strategy. That's how you stop the infiltration by Fick. The tokenization, the privatization, the securitization that leads to currency wars, installation, colored revolutions, regime changes, IMF debt dependencies, and the removal of all sovereign ability and dollarization of your economy.
Beautiful. Simon, thank you so much for coming and giving us an update. Really appreciate it. Tell everybody where can they go and find your work, follow you, get more of it. Where can they go? Where are the fun links?
So I every Friday on YouTube, I cover all the financial flows that week on a Friday and try and make some predictions for the next week, and then analyze what I got wrong, what I got right, how I update the analysis. Because some people don't have 2-3 hours, and sometimes I can go on for a long time. I kind of put it all into AI and it creates a blog post, a 5-minute summary, a 20-minute summary for those that don't have the time. That's all on simondixon.com. And I give my real-time analysis on X at Simon Dixon Twit. And that's about all I can handle. I try to repost it onto Nosta. At some point, we're going to have to figure that one out. Because I just keep finding myself still on YouTube and X. And at some point, I'm fully aware I'm building my social credit score. But for whatever reason, that's where the traffic is. And at some point, through necessity, we'll have to make that transition.
When I first got into Bitcoin, I was overwhelmed. The jargon, the security risks, the fear that one mistake could cost everything. I remember staring at my screen and wondering, are my keys safe? Did I do this right? That experience is why I started BTC Sessions. For over a decade, this channel has helped millions of people like you learn how to use and secure Bitcoin. But I realized something. For many people, videos aren't enough. Everyone learns differently. Some need to ask questions in real time as an expert walks through their setup, their goals, and their threat model. And certain things like advanced cold storage, inheritance planning, privacy, and node or mining setups often can't be fully solved by watching another tutorial. So I built BTC Mentor. I recruited the best Bitcoin educators on the planet to work with you one-on-one. Real experts, real answers, personalized hands-on guidance tailored to your exact situation. Whether you're brand new or building a complex setup, we meet you where you're at and walk with you step by step. By the end, you don't just hope your Bitcoin is safe, you know it is. If you're ready for that level of confidence, then head to btcmentor.io and book a call with us today.
If you enjoyed this episode with Simon Dixon, check out the previous episode with Doomberg and James Lavish or the recent live stream.